In this video, we're going to continue to look at the preface to the Legacy Standard Bible. The Legacy Standard Bible is an update to the New American Standard Bible, particularly the 95 New American Standard Bible, and it is being produced by Pastor John MacArthur and faculty from Master's Seminary. So far, I have looked at the key principles to the preface to the Legacy Standard Bible, and in this video, I want to look a little bit here at the modern English usage section of this preface. The Legacy Standard Bible preface says, "Modern English usage. The attempt has been made to render the grammar and terminology in contemporary English when word-for-word literalness was determined unacceptable to the modern reader. A change was made in the direction of a more current English idiom. In the instances where this has been done, the more literal rendering has been indicated in the notes. There are a few exceptions to this procedure. Of note, while an effort has been to incorporate conjunctions as much as possible, the conjunction "and" is occasionally not translated at the beginning of sentences because of differences in style between ancient and modern writing. Punctuation is a relatively modern invention, and ancient writers often linked most of their sentences with "and" or other connectives. So what this section is saying is that they're really trying to render the ancient languages in contemporary English. This is a contemporary English translation. It's not like the King James Version. They're really trying to make sure that it reads in a way that's very understandable and relatable to people today. At the same time, it is trying to be word for word. So this is very much in keeping with how the New American Standard Bible preface read in the past. And I want to show that to you, a comparison. On the left, we have the 95 NASB preface, and on the right is the LSB preface. And as you can see, there's a lot of similarity here in how they read. It does say, though, in the 95, there are a few exceptions to this procedure, and particularly, frequently, "and" is not translated at the beginning of sentences because of differences in style between ancient and modern writing. Punctuation is a relatively modern invention. In the LSB, it says, "Of note, while an effort has been to incorporate conjunctions as much as possible, the conjunction "and" is occasionally not translated at the beginning of sentences because of differences in style between ancient and modern writing." So both prefaces are bringing out the fact that one of the differences between the ancient language and our language, English, is that they use conjunctions a lot more than we do, and it's a question of how much do you translate those conjunctions. The 95 tended toward not translating them as much, but the LSB is going to translate them quite a bit. So to show you an example here from the Legacy Standard Bible, you can see in the first chapter of Mark, at the beginning of the verses, there are a lot of "ands." And so if you see here verse 17 and, 18 and, 19 and, 20 and, 21 and, 22 and, 23 and. So you can see in the Legacy Standard Bible, they've really tried to retain a lot of those conjunctions. To see a comparison here, someone actually did a comparison on a blog post, and it says conjunctions at the beginning of sentences are much better preserved in the LSB versus the NASB 95. And you can see here the difference is the 95 is what he's actually crossed out there. So the "ands" are in the LSB, but the 95 does not have "ands" in these places. So keeping all of those conjunctions in the Legacy Standard Bible is one of those areas where the Legacy Standard Bible is actually more like the NASB 77, which I think you'll see retains a lot of those conjunctions. So in this way, they're harking back to the 77 edition of the NASB in keeping those conjunctions at the beginning of these sentences. Now, one really interesting comparison to make is between the NASB 95, which I have on the left here, and the NASB 2020, the present edition of the New American Standard Bible. And what's interesting here is you can see verse 17, they both have the word "and." But if you look in verse 19, the 95 does not have the conjunction, but in verse 19 in the 2020, the conjunction "and" is there. Also, verse 22, you can see the 95 does not have the conjunction, but in the 2020 edition, the word "and" is there at the beginning of this verse. So it actually looks like the NASB 2020 takes a little bit more of a middle road approach and translates more of those conjunctions than was in the 95. Now, the reason for the differences actually has to do with English style. when we speak in English or write in English, we don't put "and" at the beginning of every sentence. So the 95 NASB was trying to read more like contemporary normal English, whereas the Legacy Standard Bible and the older NASB retain those "ands," which is not how we typically write in English, but it is a more literal rendering, I guess you could say. Another area where you can see a little bit more literal rendering in the Legacy Standard Bible is at the beginning of Mark 1, verse 9, where in the NASB 95 and 2020, it just says, "In those days Jesus came from Nazareth." But in the Legacy Standard Bible, it says, "Now it happened that in those days Jesus came from Nazareth." I think the NASB 77 said, "Now it came about." So that extra phrase there at the beginning of Mark 1:9 is something that you would see in the original language, but the 95 and 2020 NASB did not include it because it's a little bit superfluous in English. But if you want to be very literal, they've decided to keep it in here in the Legacy Standard Bible, which again is more like the NASB 77. Now, we all have different opinions as to whether making these choices is a good thing, particularly when it comes to things like conjunctions. And the point I would make actually has to do with what they say in both of the prefaces that we read, that punctuation that we have today is a relatively modern invention. So the way that we delineate between sentences is using periods, whereas in the biblical writing you might see those "ands" to delineate between sentences. And that really brings up an issue that I was thinking about, and something I've talked about, that more of a hidden form of interpretation is punctuation, because translators actually add punctuation. And so we talk about wanting a literal translation, but one of the ways in which translations are changing the text from the original, at least to some degree, is they're adding punctuation. And so that is a measure of interpretation on the part of the translator. So the reason I bring this up is because when you have those sentences, some people would argue you really need to have the "ands" in there, you need to have the conjunctions in there. Well, it's really a judgment call, because we now can put periods in between sentences to delineate between the two statements, whereas in their time period, they would tend to use the word "and." They'd put in some sort of a conjunction to show that this is a separate thought. But just to show you quickly here how putting in punctuation is a form of interpretation, in that there are judgment calls when it comes to punctuation, I wanted to show you the NASB compared to the NIV in John chapter 3. And if you look here in John chapter 3 in the NASB, there's a quote here starting in verse 10 where Jesus answered and said, "Are you the teacher of Israel?" And that quote there goes all the way through the rest of this paragraph into the next paragraph to the end of verse 21, including John 3:16, which this says is quoting Jesus, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." If you look in the New International Version, though, you'll see that, again, we have Jesus quoted here in verse 10, and that quote continues on to the end of that paragraph. However, it ends actually here at the end of this paragraph in verse 15, and so verses 16 through 21 in the New International Version are not actually a quotation of Jesus. So depending on how you think about this, that might rub you the wrong way. You might say, no, the NASB is right and the NIV is wrong. Or you might say the NIV is right and the NASB is wrong. But this is an area of judgment call. This is an area where the translators have to actually do a little bit of interpreting here and saying who is actually speaking in these verses. Is it Jesus, or is it the author of the book, John, who's adding some commentary to what Jesus is saying? And the point I'm making is that the original writer didn't put the punctuation in there to make that very clear. That's something that the translators added. So getting back to the Legacy Standard Bible and those judgment calls about things like conjunctions, some people would argue, yeah, you should have those conjunctions in there. I would say they're not always necessary, because now we have punctuation, and the punctuation helps us to know where sentences end and begin. On the other hand, I do think there is a place for very literal translations, even translations that include all those conjunctions, just so you can see how the original read a little bit more clearly. So I think there's a place for something like this, and I think the Legacy Standard Bible is going to fulfill a niche. But I think whether we add conjunctions or take them out is not a hill we want to die on. I think that's just a matter of judgment calls that we have to make, and balancing out the fact that the ancient languages are not exactly like the way that we write today. Overall, though, the Legacy Standard Bible is probably going to read a little bit more in some ways like the New American Standard Bible 77 rather than the 95, although I find it very fascinating that the NASB 2020 is actually maybe a little bit more literal than even the NASB 95, at least in the area of conjunctions in the passage that we looked at there. So I find that really interesting. Anyway, I just wanted to share a little bit more about the preface of the Legacy Standard Bible with you. I will continue to talk about this in future videos because I know it's a really interesting topic to people. I'd love to hear what you think about all of this in the comments below. Just try to keep those comments positive and helpful to discussion. But thank you as always for listening to some of what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.